Okay, well, I see that I have other super chats now. So I guess I will move back to those. Why can't I do in a non-marital Catholic? What can't I do in a non-marital Catholic relationship according to the church? Okay, um, this is always a fun one. I actually just wrote a script on chastity and overcoming lust. I don't know when I'm going to release it, but St. Thomas, he has some good counsels on how to preserve chastity. So I made those into a video, and it required me to explain some of the principles. But basically, when it comes to the acts between men and women, there are what are called primary sexual acts and then secondary sexual acts. So whether they have a per se and direct relationship with sexual activity or an indirect and preparatory way. Okay, so obviously the primary sexual act is intercourse. We all know this. Many know this, but when it comes to the secondary sexual act are those acts which are able to prepare the genitals, to be able to prepare the sexual organs for functioning properly. So this would be certain touches, kisses, looks, words, etc. All of those things which prepare one for the act. Now, when it even comes to married couples can treat these acts in a way that is improper, not done for the sake of preparation, but done for the sake of pleasure alone. And when it comes to the marital act for the sake of pleasure alone, according to Blessed Innocent XI, it is something which is venially sinful. And the same goes for everything that prepares for the marital act as well. The same reasoning applies to both. So when it comes to unmarried couples, obviously, when it comes to the primary sexual act, that is not something that unmarried couples can engage in. Now, when it comes to the secondary sexual acts, there's obviously a bit of confusion here, right? Because it would be one thing for one to deliberately engage in any of these in order to have venereal pleasure. So that is the pleasure which is somehow related to sex. It would be one thing to deliberately engage for that sake in these secondary sexual acts, which obviously would be a violation. But it's another thing, many say that when it comes to some of these acts, that they're actually not doing it for the sake of venereal pleasure, but for other purposes. So there's a certain very important doctrine of the moralists. And this doctrine is the distinction between the metaphysical and the moral distinction between what's called sensible pleasure. So the enjoyment that I get, for touching a blanket, let's say, that's a sensible pleasure, and venereal pleasure, the enjoyment that one has in connection with the sex act. So basically, when it comes to the state of original sin, it is very difficult for us to actually distinguish between those two things right there. Now, when it comes to venereal pleasure, venereal pleasure sometimes comes to us in a way that's unintentional. So, you see something, a thought pops into the mind, you accidentally touch something, and the venereal pleasure comes, and one obviously has an obligation to resist this. And those various looks, touches, words, etc., they can often, while unintentional, so you don't intend to engage in venereal pleasure, sometimes it creeps up from those acts unintentionally because of the accidental connection they have with it. So what are the conclusions that we can draw from this sort of theoretical framework that I kind of put there that may be hard to draw practical conclusions? Well, the first one is that insofar as one is able to, one should avoid those looks, touches, words, etc. So insofar as one is able to, they should avoid all of them, because they are all an occasion of, even if one wants to think that it is merely sensible pleasure, one, because of their inability due to original sin to clearly distinguish between the two, venereal and sensible pleasure, one should avoid all occasions. But you may say that's very crazy because, obviously, let's say the old case of the girlfriend grabs my hand. Should I smack it away? Should I just no smack it away? Yes. No, just joking. Okay. So when it comes to things like that, because this does not have that essential relation with the acquiring of venereal pleasure, one should, and one has the obligation to, resist any venereal pleasure which arises from any one of those looks, touches, etc. And one should have a sufficient and proportionate justification. So we can think of various different examples of this. So the case of like a general matter of custom, like, the girlfriend touches your hand, you shouldn't smack the hand away. That would be autistic. What you should do is maybe afterwards explain the fact like, hey, no touching, okay? These are touches, no touching. But there are other cases as well we can think of this. Like, for example, if you have a medical doctor often has to see the indecent parts of women. And in this case, it would be sufficiently justified by their practice, by the fact that this is their career. They have the obligation to resist any venereal pleasures, and it would be sinful for him to put himself in that situation without sufficient justification. Like, let's say, he's like, oh, I'm a doctor. I see undressed women all the time. I'm going to go to a strip club or something. That would not be sufficient justification unless there was a medical emergency there, I guess. I don't know why I added that caveat. But where was I going? Yeah, there has to be a sufficient justification. Let's say, you have a woman who is drowning and you have to obviously, come into physical contact with her to save her. That would be sufficient justification. In all those cases, so it's different than, these secondary acts, these acts of physical contact, etc. They are different from the primary sexual act. Obviously, when it comes to the primary sexual act, there's no justification whatsoever outside of the state of marriage for ever engaging in this. One should die and let the entire world burn before they did that, because that is a sin. You should never sin. When it comes to those secondary acts, because of it's sinful to act in a way to deliberately receive venereal pleasure, okay? So that also, better to let the entire world burn than to kiss your girlfriend for venereal pleasure. Then you have that other category, though, the category of, this is merely an occasion. It brings out venereal pleasure that I can't really distinguish from sensible pleasure. One can engage in these acts with sufficient justification, but it has to be sufficient in a proportionately grave reason. One cannot just do it because they feel like it, okay? That's not how it works. So, yeah, that's the traditional teaching of moral authors is, in broad strokes, that, although sometimes they're going to dive into deeper details. And as they dive into deeper details, sometimes there's differences. But broadly speaking, that's that.